Time to take off yet again to the neurodiverse skies. I'm James Hollis, a proud autistic voice and Top Gun fan, here with my wingman.
James Kenyon, your ADHD co-host from the northeast of England. Welcome to the NeuroPod, where we explore neurodivergence and neuroinclusion, from autism to ADHD, with real stories and practical tips for parents, allies, and anyone navigating a neurotypical world.
We're here recording from Liverpool's lively Merseyside port, a bastion of northern strength. Today's episode will dive back into primary school years at around age 10, my experiences when things got a bit trickier, from social shifts to being labelled eccentric or something else. Was it schizophrenia? Or was it just autism misunderstood?
Expect raw insights from Maverick. Perfect for everyone curious about neurodivergence. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, the NeuroPod, all one word, or catch our exclusive clips on YouTube. Share our neurodivergent positivity and let's hit the schoolyard with Mr. Hollis. So, James, there's quite a dramatic word in your introduction there, and I think that we shouldn't go any further without exploring that in some detail. And that word is schizophrenic. And can I ask where that word actually came from when it was applied to you?
Well, thank you, James. When I use schizophrenia in this context, I use it. It's not because it's a word that's just plucked out of nowhere. There was actually a belief that I had a form of schizophrenia when I was at primary school. And that's because of the imaginary games I was playing, especially with the really creative side of those imaginary games and the sort of role playing and the characters. And the teachers who were observing this got concerned after a while. When they had parent-teacher meetings with my parents, they said, we're a bit concerned about James because he does have a really vivid imagination, and we're sort of concerned maybe if he has a form of mental health issue, maybe something along the lines of, dare we say it, something like schizophrenia, which they whispered to my parents at the time. And my parents also got concerned about this, but they didn't really bear it much regard, fortunately, because they knew me and they knew that I just had a very vivid imagination. And it was quite clear at the time that there was no mental health issue that I was particularly going through. And of course, a lot of this is because teachers at the time were trying to put me into a box. Like, I guess they were putting everybody into a box to sort of sum up who I was as an individual. And this is not just one example of this actually happening. We'll come on to talk about him in later episodes, but the renowned world expert on autism, Professor Tony Attwood, he recounts a story of a time when a psychologist went to go and see some parents who were concerned that their little girl had a form of schizophrenia. A psychologist or a psychiatrist, I can't remember which, but the psychiatrist visited the little girl in question and did perform some tests. And they also let it be known that the little girl was on the autistic spectrum. And then the psychologist went back to the parents and said, that's not schizophrenia, that's loneliness.
I mean, to be absolutely honest with you, labeling anyone in what seems to be almost a casual way as schizophrenic seems to be what can only be described as rather problematic.
No, of course, and it adds sort of a stigma to schizophrenia as a condition. I mean, we'll no doubt come on to talk about schizophrenia in episodes in the future as we go on to explore mental health in a bit of detail. But we're talking about, this was a very different time. It was the 1990s. Back then, mental health was an area which was complete taboo. You didn't talk about this sort of area, not like compared to today, where we feel, comparatively speaking, much more open about discussing mental health issues, not just like schizophrenia, but also depression, bipolar disorder, etc. But back then, it was something quite hard to say to parents. Your son has a form of mental illness or of a mental condition, and that sort of hit hard as far as they were concerned. But they were actually quite confident that there wasn't any mental health issue, because they knew that I was very happy. There was nothing, my needs were being met. So it wasn't a case of, they said, oh yeah, we're concerned because there may be an issue here relating to mental health, and there's something here that we need to address in terms of professionally address. But there was this attempt to try and add a label to describe the way I used to behave at primary school, which I'm happy to say a lot of this vivid imagination had a lot to do with the fact that when it was difficult to make friends, I just took the decision, well, I've got to create my own friends. And in this case, they were just imaginary and they had unique characters. So we come back to what I was mentioning when we talked about Thomas the Tank Engine. It's all about getting to know characters. But in this regard, and coming back to what we said in our last episode about having control, I could actually control the characters in such a way that I knew that the characters that I created were like the perfect friends I could have or I could want. And it was predictable in terms of how they would behave with respect to me.
Yeah, I mean, can you describe one of your imaginary friends and maybe how they helped you cope with the changes that you went through in primary school?
Okay, so there was one, and that comes back to my interest in sort of military history. I did have one. It was a sergeant major, stern-looking sergeant major, who was there and always sort of supported me in terms of motivation. So when things weren't going well, because obviously I'd read about sergeants and sergeant majors who were in the rank and file, who were motivating the troops, supporting the officers, that when things weren't going well, he was there to always motivate me. So he was always there to give me support for whatever I was doing. So if I had problems with interactions with other people, it was always a case of, come on, pull yourself together. You're a soldier on, etc.
When you felt left out, as you were talking about in a previous episode, was that sort of like a motivator for you to not feel quite as badly about that as you otherwise might have done?
Yeah, sure. And I think it was someone who motivated me when I didn't feel motivated neither by friends nor by a lot of teachers, because I did stand out as being quite unique and not fitting in.
Did any of your teachers or parents or any of your other friends indeed notice these imaginary friends, and what did they think about this scenario?
I was always careful to keep my imaginary friends quite private. I did sort of by the age of like 8 or 9, I did recognize that there was something not, if I can use the term, normal about this situation and having imaginary friends. And there was also, I guess there was a degree of embarrassment on my side. What would happen if people found out about the names of an imaginary friend like the Sergeant Major? Would they probably use that to be particularly mean to me. So I was quite private about my imaginary world. And that's why I played my cards very close to my chest in that regard. But there was nothing sinister about that sort of imaginary world I had and the people that existed therein, just trying to get along, if not sometimes trying to survive in what was not a very supportive environment as I found it at the time.
You mentioned Professor Tony Attwood in relation to living in a world of your own, as it were. And some people hinted while you were at school that might be the schizophrenia. I think I'm right in saying that. Am I right? Is that about right?
Yes, that's correct. I never had no concerns at the time about what I was doing, because for me, this was sort of a last resort, if you like. And I think like that for many kids who are on the autistic spectrum who don't have a lot of friends, because whatever you may say, of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but those with autism also need friends. We need a community around us. And if we're not getting it, then we'll try and improvise as best we can. And so the example I gave you of the little girl that Professor Tony Attwood talked about, she was also like me, trying to cope with the fact that she didn't feel like she was living in a society where she felt accepted. And in particular, she didn't have a community around her. I'm quite confident of the fact that if I had felt properly included at primary school, that imaginary world, those imaginary friends would not have existed. They would never have come into being in the first place. And the Sergeant Major would certainly have not come into existence, because, of course, I would have felt like I had a strong community of supportive people around me.
Can you give us an example for when you were at primary school? In your last conversation, you said you like planning and you like certainty. And I think one of the things you've said is that you loved order in primary school and that you were aiming to be the best behaved because you like rules. When did that help you to shine at primary school? Was there a particular incidence of that?
Well, I think when it came to rules help those who are on the spectrum make sense of the world, and it helps deal with any sense of anxiety that we may have. So when it came to school, I was true to say, as you've just mentioned, I was the best behaved when it came to, as far as the teachers were concerned, when it came to our, daily classes and getting your homework done on time. I was always the one who had everything done and dusted, whereas others may not have had. I think there was also an element of fear as well, because of the hypersensitivity and the sensory overload. Something that I didn't take well to was being spoken at loudly, if I can put it delicately, by the teachers. So it was a case of, well, in order to avoid that, you better follow the rules and do your homework on time to not suffer, which it was, because being sort of talked at loudly, or let's just put it, shout at, by anybody is not pleasant. But for those who have sensory overload and issues in relation there too, that can be particularly, that the pain that you experience can be particularly acute.
That's an interesting comment about sensory overload, particularly in relation to, in this case, being motivated almost by fear. I think I'm right in saying sensory overload could cover a very big spectrum, not just being shouted at. Was there a particular time at primary school where you struggled with, or incidents at primary school where you struggled with this sort of thing? And could you give us some examples?
So that's a good question. These sort of memories are still quite hazy in that regard. I think one of the things I struggled with, which I can think of or recall, would have been a time when I really, again, we come back to the dreaded M word, mathematics, and a time when I really did not know how to approach a particular piece of homework. And I just didn't know what to do, really. And I didn't want to ask my parents because I wanted to actually do it sort of on my own, try and work it out, figure it out on my own. So what I did was I decided not to do the homework on the evening that it was assigned to me. And I would go to my maths teacher following day, ask to have it explained again. And then I would do it the following evening and then resubmit it. Well, I wasn't submitting it just to say, just get it submitted, just a bit asking for an extension. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. The reaction was not good because the homework had not been done. But I was already in a heightened state of stress because the rule which I'd been expected to follow, do your homework on time, had not been fulfilled. So you had one layer of anxiety and stress in that regard. In addition to that, you had the stress of, how is your teacher going to react to this? And the third, I didn't understand how to approach the homework which had been assigned to me. And then my maths teacher gave me a really heavy dressing down in front of everybody. For me, I had to seriously bite my tongue because it was like, I felt like I was just going to collapse because it was just all too much. It was like the final straw. I composed myself. I had moistened eyes, to say the least, as you would at that sort of age. And then the rest of it was one of those where, you'd have a huge dressing down in front of the whole class, and the rest of that class, whatever it was, half an hour, 40 minutes, the students were the best behaved that you would see anywhere because, of course, everyone was shocked at the reaction. And the best part of that class, of course, was leaving it at the end of the session.
I think that's a fantastic example, if I can put it that way, of negative reinforcement as opposed to positive reinforcement. And I can imagine, I don't know quite how old you were at that point, but I can imagine that would have frightened quite a lot of children into sort of even more conformity, I suppose.
Sure. And as you said, negative reinforcement, you're not actually helping the situation. If the pupil is struggling, the key, as far as I would be concerned, is, are they trying? And I was trying. And not only that, they knew I was a rule follower and the best behaved. So I don't see how that is actually a just way of reacting to a pupil who is in that context.
No, and I'm sure many of our listeners would agree with that. I wanted to ask whether, speaking about negative reinforcement, whether you, on the flip side, had any occasions where there was positive reinforcement, so you had praise for following rules and following order, whether there was any time whether that actually gave you a positive reward or a positive reaction.
I think that was with respect to those subjects at school that I was good at. So I mentioned history, languages, though my history teacher was also quite, could be quite difficult to get on with at the best of times. But languages, certainly, whenever I did well, it was the teacher who just took the view is I can rely on James as a pupil to do the right thing. And that helps me out because I can then focus on those pupils in the class who may be struggling with languages. So in this case, learning French. So that helped. And it made French lessons, French classes less stressful and, dare I say it, even enjoyable. But it made the rest of my life at primary school as I said, I was a slow learner. So pretty much all the other subjects I was learning quite slowly. It made the rest of the experience not that great. My French classes and maybe history classes were the two sort of classes where I had the least amount of anxiety when compared to, as I've just mentioned, mathematics.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on your learning style, actually. Was there a time when one of your teachers commented on your slow learning and maybe expressed frustration or annoyance or anything like that you can remember and that maybe stuck with you?
I think that looking back, there were a couple of occasions where I thought they weren't being very helpful when it came to what I was experiencing when it came to the learning that I found particularly challenging. I'm a very inquisitive person. Like with the locomotives and sort of the steam engines, I like to work out how things work. I remember whenever I asked questions that I genuinely didn't know the answer to, I was met with the response of, well, you should know that. It's obvious what the answer is. And then, of course, then the others in the class would laugh. I'm afraid, regardless of what's going through the teacher's mind, that's no way to respond to someone. Because if a pupil is asking a question, obviously they don't have the knowledge. If you're deriding them and sort of saying, you should know this, you should know the answer to that. Then if they're inquisitive, which is, by the way, a great thing, because it's great to be curious in life, and that's how you discover new things. That's how some of the greatest scientists achieve some of their greatest breakthrough, was by being curious about the world and curious about particular questions. But if you're reacting in that way to a school pupil, then the natural reaction is therefore never to ask. And something I learned later, which we'll probably go on to discuss at a later stage when we come to my experiences at secondary school, is that I was put with a maths teacher who was excellent. And really, that's where I had my real breakthroughs. And when it came to my learnings in mathematics, he said, I expect you all to be asking questions because that is how you will learn to crack this subject.
Yes, and I think if you're speaking about a subject which you find difficult, such as maths, having somebody with patience and kindness, did you feel that helped?
We'll come on to talk about this in the future episodes when we talk about secondary school, but I'm glad you raised that because it made so much of a difference to what I had been experiencing previously, because it emboldened me, it built my confidence, whereas I feel my primary school experience when it came to mathematics was being really damaged. And it doesn't just damage your confidence when it comes to a subject, it damages also your sense of self-esteem in general, because you take the view, unlike everybody else, there's something wrong with me. I must be a broken human being, when actually you're not a broken human being. You're faced with an area of learning which is particularly challenging. My view is, looking back, we need to look at exploring another different teaching methods until we align on the right one which works for you.
I think the two words that spring to mind very much are somebody who has compassion and kindness, particularly as a teacher. Now, they've got a very difficult job, but I think, as we're trying to do with this podcast, knowledge is power. And so if you're going to go back to talk to one of your teachers in primary school now, with kindness and compassion, of course, what would you say to them?
Emphasize that kindness and compassion back, even though you weren't from time to time on the receiving end of it. Absolutely, James. So it's a very interesting question. I think what I would do is that if I had to ask them to have adapted their sort of teaching style, I would have asked them to have a bit more patience above all else. Not everybody learns at the speed of the best pupils in the class. And it's just good teaching, actually, to learn at the speed of one of the slowest members of the class, because that's how you can bring the whole class with you and develop them all. The last thing you want to do is split a class up into two. Okay. So what I mean by that is I remember in primary school, we had two sets. We had the top set and the bottom set. I was in the bottom set, but those are the ones who are not as good as those who were sitting with the other teacher. And I think the worst thing you could do in that situation was to take the bottom set and divide it even further between those who were the top of the bottom and those who were bottom of the bottom. If you see what I mean?
Yeah, and it's also it's about the teachers, and this is probably coming on to structural issues within the education system, but it's about having the teachers being able to have the time to be able to maybe address individual needs of children. And it doesn't always, from what you're saying, in the subjects that you struggle with, it didn't sound like the teacher had much time or patience.
I think that was my experience. And if we're going to go back and say to them, I would ask you to have more patience, because that is such a key prerequisite for any teacher, especially those kids who are in primary school. Those are the formative years of their lives when they're trying to make sense of who they are as individuals. And that's where you can make or break a child's confidence. And my confidence was it wasn't shattered, so to speak, irreparably shattered, because I was quite lucky because home life was very supportive. My mother did an amazing job when it came to making me feel good about myself. But I also recognize the fact that in that regard, I was lucky. And there are a lot of neurodivergent kids out there who may not have as stable a family home life as they would like. And then if they're not getting the support at school, then of course things are going to be really difficult for them as a whole.
Yes, it's almost, from what you're saying there, it's like almost double negative reinforcement. And it almost, I imagine, would add to the trauma that would be suffered, particularly by kids at a young age who don't really know what's happening to them. And maybe the adults don't really understand what's happening to them either, which, as I say, is why we're trying to raise this awareness.
Sure. And I also want to try and move away from this idea of just trying to put kids into a particular box, because I was, and the box I was put into when I was at primary school was into the low performance box. And that was clear. I mean, they didn't say that to me, but I could tell, even at that age, sort of like 10 or 11, I could tell that I was regarded as a low performer. So much so that once when I did a maths exercise, it was like an internal exam we did, and I went from C or D to suddenly a B plus. I remember the teacher saying, "Oh, look at how well you've done that exam," and sort of expressing a surprise. There was more of that than a case of I always knew you could do it. What they didn't know at the same time, because I hadn't told them, is I was getting after school lessons in maths. So it wasn't as a result of their teaching that I was actually succeeding eventually when it came to mathematics in the run up to my common entrance exams for secondary school. It's because of the external help that my parents had brought in to try and support me in this area.
Yes, without wishing to go into it too deeply, it sounds as though if you're fortunate enough to be able to supplement your children's or your child's learning, then that is a very beneficial thing. But obviously there are a lot of parents and a lot of schools that won't be in that position. And so that makes it even harder, I would imagine, for people to fulfill their potential.
Sure. And I was lucky again in that regard, because I had very supportive parents who understood, had a great understanding for the importance of education, the impact that it could have on a child's life chances later on in life. And I remember one of the defining moments, which was a very unpleasant experience, but it actually got me the extra tuition I needed. It was a decision was made. My mother and father went to go and see the headmaster and said, right, we want James to be considered for these various schools, which was some of the best, sort of the best schools, sort of like Westminster schools, St. Paul's, etc. His headmaster sort of turned around and said, no way. This is not James's ability. James hasn't got this ability. And I would, I said, well, what ability has he got? I said, well, we're going to have to probably put him into he's going to have to go for a school which is not really noteworthy, because we don't think he's going to get into any other school. And my parents took the decision that they've said, right, we're going to get the external support that he needs. to make sure he gets into a really good school. And my mother was like being someone who's very positive. And obviously it was her son, her eldest son, and her firstborn. And she sort of said, I will not write off my son at this age, the age of sort of 10 years old.
Oh, James, what a journey. That's an amazing story once again, talking about your imaginary friends being misread almost as having schizophrenia, your positive and negative reinforcement that you experienced at school. And what's one thing that you'd like our listeners to take away from your later primary school years, particularly on relation to neuroinclusion?
Well, I mentioned about the importance of being patient, but also to encourage inquisitiveness. I think that is so important, as I mentioned. Even if a pupil asks you something which is so basic, would be my ask to all teachers out there, treat the question with real respect. I would really ask you to do that, because it shows that the pupil has a very curious intellect, and most importantly has the motivation to learn. Otherwise they wouldn't be asking the question in the first place. And no matter what question it may be, if it's treated with respect, that will embolden them to ask other questions and which would then help improve their learning as a result.
I think that's spot on. Thank you, James. If this resonates with you as you're listening, please take the moment to subscribe to the NeuroPod on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's all one word. Or you can catch our exclusive clips on YouTube. I can't even say it. Join our Neuro Odyssey from Liverpool to platform 9 3/4 and beyond, and share our podcast to spread neurodivergence positivity.
Thank you, James. And thank you, listeners, for listening. And with that all said, let's continue to fly high like Maverick. Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.